All right, I think we're live. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruben Matthew. I'm a Capella Fellow with DFA and a fourth-year medical student at St. George's University. Welcome to our webinar today. It's entitled Beneficial to Whom? A Review of Makena and the FDA's Accelerated Approval Process. Before we get started, I'd like to take a quick minute to officially invite you to join Doctors for America. It's great. As a DFA team member, we'll put a link in the chat. We'll also be live streaming to Facebook Live and making a recording of all the materials available afterwards. So a few quick ground rules. Please feel free to ask any questions. There are no stupid questions. And please remember to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will also be addressing your questions during the second half of our session. And also look out for comments in the chat. Other staff members will be pasting helpful links during the session. So now on to our wonderful panelists for today's session. First, we have Dr. Elena Callender speaking. Callender, she's a board certified OBGYN who's been in practice for over 15 years. She just finished her MPH at George Washington University, did her School of Medicine training at University of Maryland, and finished her residency at Wright State. She takes a broad view of women's health, realizing that there are many factors that can contribute to overall wellness. Prior to her medical career, she actually trained as a journalist. She continues to use media to help raise awareness of important women's health issues. We also have Dr. Adam Murato here. He's a maternal fetal medicine specialist in his hometown of Framingham, Massachusetts. He also grew up there and attended Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. He did his OBGYN residency at Brigham and at MGH. He did his MFM fellowship at Tufts Medical Center. His interests include medication exposure in pregnancy and conflicts of interest in medicine. So I think we have two people highly equipped to talk about today's topic. So with all that being said, let's begin. Dr. Callender.
Hello, thanks for having me to speak today. Give me a moment. I'm gonna bring up my slides. Okay, and I will, here we go, share screen. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay. So we're talking today about some issues at the FDA, and most recently there has been a lot of discussion about a certain drug called Makena. And so we're discussing the FDA accelerated approval process, and we're asking the question, to whom is it beneficial, or for whom is it beneficial? So Makena is the brand name of a drug approved via the accelerated pathway. It is indicated for the prevention of preterm birth in women with a history of preterm birth. Since its approval in 2011, Makena has been widely used, and it has become the standard of care, being recommended by large obstetrics professional societies. A confirmatory trial failed to demonstrate the drug's efficacy, and the FDA is now considering withdrawing approval and removing the drug from the market. Accelerated approval allows for earlier approval of drugs that treat serious conditions and meet an unmet medical need. Approval may be granted based on trials that show an impact on a surrogate endpoint, meaning something that is expected to predict clinical benefit. Drug manufacturers must then complete a confirmatory trial to confirm the anticipated clinical benefit before traditional approval is granted. So this is just some history about the actual chemical compound that makes up Makena. It's a synthetic progesterone that has been studied since the 1960s. There were first reports of progesterone supplementation in the 1960s that was helping to prevent preterm birth. and multiple studies followed that. In the 1990s, there was a significant study that involved a meta-analysis that showed that it can be effective as a prophylactic agent for preterm birth. Then in 2003, there was a study with maternal fetal medicine, and the primary author was Meese. And this study showed that the compound 17-OHPC, which, as I mentioned, is a synthetic form of progesterone, appears to reduce the risk of preterm birth. So after this, doctors around the country began using a compounded form of this drug for patients and they were getting a weekly injection starting around 16 to 20 weeks estimated gestational age up to 36 weeks estimated gestational age. In 2011, the FDA granted accelerated approval for Makena, and they were relying on evidence from that trial in 2003. And this approval requires that the sponsor or the manufacturer complete another study that confirms the clinical benefit of Makena. So once this was approved, the drug maker then pushed to bar compounding pharmacies from making and selling 17-OHPC, which, as I mentioned, this was the major way that patients were getting this drug before the approval of Makena, the branded form of the drug. FDA did continue to allow compounding by pharmacies, but most use shifted to Makena. In 2012, the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology recommended offering 17-OHPC, now as Makena, to all pregnant patients with a history of preterm birth to help prevent recurrent preterm birth. After this happened, of course, there was a dramatic increase in cost to patients. The cost of the compounded form of 17-OHPC was around $10 to $20 per dose. Once it was branded as Makena, that cost increased to $1,500 per dose, and meaning that patients were going to pay some $30,000 per pregnancy. The mean per pregnancy costs were $10,917 for the branded drug and $206 for the compounded drug. And this is from a study done of insurance data from 2008 to 2015. Annual Makena revenue for the company totaled $387 million and $322 million for 2017 and 2018, respectively. And in the past 3 years alone, Medicaid has spent $700 million on Makena. And the past 3 years includes the time since the failed confirmatory trial was released. So now we're at the confirmatory trial in March 2019. This, again, is 8 years after the drug was approved. So this trial is called the Prolong trial. The results were released in March of 2019. And Makena was not found to be effective at preventing subsequent preterm birth in patients with a history of preterm birth. That following October, an FDA advisory committee recommended removing Makena from the market. And the grounds were that the confirmatory trial failed to verify the clinical benefit, and there was not substantial evidence showing that Makena is effective at reducing the risk of preterm birth. So after that, in October 2020, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research proposed withdrawing accelerated approval of Makena and wanted to remove it from the market. At that point, they offered the manufacturer the opportunity to request a hearing. The FDA said that it is within their statutory authority to ask for withdrawal of an accelerated approval when the post-approval trial fails to confirm clinical benefit, when the drug is not shown to be safe or effective. Both conditions, they said, have been met for Makena. Later that month, the drug manufacturer requested a hearing. In December of 2020, the drug manufacturer gave the information to FDA challenging withdrawal of approval. And more than a year later, this committee granted the hearing request. So during the time in between requesting the hearing and actually getting the hearing from the FDA advisory committee, Makena's company argued that the drug should remain on the market in the interest of racial equity. They argue that African American women are disproportionately impacted by preterm birth. This is definitely true. In the initial trial, which included a larger percentage of African American women, Makena was shown to be effective. And they mentioned that the drug may be uniquely effective in African American women. The subsequent confirmatory trial was a much larger trial that included women from multiple nations, and the percentage of African American women was much lower in the second trial. So the company spearheaded a campaign to get the support of African American medical associations and patient advocacy groups to speak up and make an effort to get Makena to stay on the market. So many groups and individuals were encouraged to write to the FDA or to speak at the meeting to voice support for the drug. The manufacturer actually funded a group that's called the Preterm Birth Prevention Alliance. And this group was designed to share patient stories about preterm birth at the FDA hearing. Organizations expressing support included the NAACP, the National Medical Association, Black Women's Health Imperative, National Black Nurses Association, New Voices for Reproductive Justice, Perinatal Health Equity Foundation, Sister Song, the National Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, Southern Birth Justice Network, and Spark Reproductive Justice Now. As you can tell, many of these associations mention reproductive justice or they are representative of African American individuals or communities. A letter from the Black Women's Health Imperative and signed by multiple patient advocacy groups stated, "We are dedicated to improving the health of women we serve. We are deeply concerned about the possible permanent withdrawal of the only FDA-approved treatment to help prevent early delivery in women who are at elevated risk because of a history of spontaneous preterm birth. A decision to withdraw approved 17P products may deepen profound existing maternal and infant health inequities in the United States." And this is representative of many of the statements that were made to the FDA in support of keeping Makena on the market from the lens of racial equity. So now in October of this year, we are at 11 years after accelerated approval and 3 years after the FDA initially recommended withdrawal of approval. Finally, the Obstetrics, Reproductive, and Urologic Drugs Advisory Committee held a hearing to consider withdrawal of accelerated approval for Makena. They had to vote on 2 questions. One was, do the findings from the confirmatory trial verify clinical benefit? And the answer was no, and this was a unanimous vote. The other question, should the FDA allow Makena to remain on the market? The answer was no. This is 14-1. And the one person who voted to allow it on the market also suggested that since this is the only FDA-approved medication indicated for the reduction of preterm birth, and that preterm birth is something that is disproportionately impacting African American women, it should remain on the market until further studies are done. A final decision is expected in the coming months and will be up to the FDA commissioner and the FDA chief scientist. And right now, Makena and its generics remain on the market. Women are still getting these drugs every day in OB/GYN offices all over the country. The major OB/GYN groups are continuing to recommend the drug to help prevent preterm birth in high-risk patients. And ACOG's current guidance states that they continue to support the use of progesterone supplementation in patients with a prior spontaneous preterm birth. In their statement, they said that currently 17-OHPC represents the only FDA-approved medication to help prevent recurrent spontaneous preterm birth. There's a clear demonstrable need for an effective intervention to help prevent recurrent preterm birth in individuals who are at risk, including Black and Indigenous individuals who have a higher incidence and risk of preterm birth. Additional research addressing the challenges of preterm birth prevention and treatment and identifying more clearly the groups for which 17-OHPC would be beneficial is still needed. And these are some of the references that I used in putting this together. I'll go back to I did attend the meeting, and I did give testimony regarding Makena, and it was a very interesting process to hear basically the campaign from the corporation, and also the physicians that they hired or the physicians that they asked to participate. But my part was to explain that basically the FDA has a responsibility to the American public, and the drug did not meet the requirements that the FDA has laid out as far as accelerated approval, and therefore it should be taken off the market. I addressed some of the arguments about racial equity in saying that it does not benefit anyone to have a drug on the market that doesn't work. And there was nothing in the data provided by or in the data from any of the trials that would suggest that there is any particular reason that this drug works differently on African American women versus people in other groups. Thank you.
Dr. Urado, would you like to go next? Thank you, Dr. Callender. That was excellent.
Yeah, that was terrific. That was a terrific summary going over the issues. I just want to make sure I can share my screen. Let me pull mine up. TFA final. Share screen DFA final. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
And that should be on slideshow. How's it look, Ruben?
Fantastic.
Okay, sounds good. So I just want to go over some of the lessons from Makena, from my experience in dealing with this over the last many years. I don't have any disclosures, no conflicts of interest to report. This is an important issue, as Dr. Callender had touched on a little bit there in her talk. Makena is an example. It's one drug for one condition, preterm birth, but I think it illustrates a lot of major issues with medicine and society. And I think we can learn many lessons from this, sort of how the system works, or to some extent how the system's rigged to not really work. The question that interests me or fascinates me is, how does a drug that isn't effective get injected into pregnant women for 2 decades? How does this happen? And so this is my best effort at trying to explain it. Again, how does a drug that doesn't really work actually does work in a way for almost everyone involved? And I'll explain that. So preterm birth, this is not meant to be a preterm birth class, so I won't go too much into detail, but it's birth before 37 weeks, and it's a major issue in the United States and around the world. There's a lot of complications of prematurity, increased rates of death, obviously, and then a lot of morbidity in the children born preterm. Rates around the world are somewhere between 5 and 20%, as you can see from this paper that came out in the Lancet. Lots of purple on the map. And the countries that lead the way are the ones that are most populous. So you see India and China, the US and Brazil here. Again, it's not meant to be a class on preterm birth, but this slide is just meant to show that the causes are multifactorial. There's a lot of different causes that can lead to preterm birth. And you can see this, things like infections, uterine anomalies, maternal medical conditions. There's also this notion of the baby wanting out and maybe signaling in some cases to come out. So the take-home point of all the introduction is that preterm birth is a significant problem. We don't really understand it. It's multifactorial, and there's probably no magic bullet, but people have sought this. One of the reasons I think that we seek these magic bullets is that our society does a fairly good job at producing magic bullets or drugs versus coming up with broader social solutions. One thing that's important to remember when you think about Makena is the DES tragedy. So DES was a synthetic hormone that was given to millions of women back for over 30 years, from 1938 to 1971. It harmed moms and babies and future generations. It wasn't safe. It wasn't effective. And everybody who studies this agrees we should have never do anything like this again, give synthetic hormones to pregnant women that don't work and can cause harm. But we actually did that again with Makena, as I'll get into. Makena is 17-OHP or 17P. It used to be called delalutin. This is the chemical formula. It's a synthetic progestin. It was approved in 1956 to prevent complications. The reason I show the chemical structure, one of my chief interests is I think we've got too many chemicals in general going into moms and babies during pregnancy. The reason I show the chemical structure is just to remind people that these aren't naturally occurring things. These are chemical compounds that come out of chemical manufacturing facilities. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Delalutin or 17P or 17-OHP or Makena, it was hoped that it might work to actually prevent pregnancy complications, but a proper trial was needed. This was the trial Dr. Callender referred to, the MFM units trial or NICHD trial. It's also known as the MEAS trial, and it was published in 2003 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It made a big splash when it came out because it showed a decrease in preterm birth in women treated with Makena or 17P. But there were right off the bat multiple problems with it. The randomization was not effective. The randomization failed. The placebo group was a much higher risk group, which had more prior preterm births. And what the trial ended up showing, the MEAS trial showed an decrease in preterm birth, but it was odd because the placebo group had a 55% or 54.9% rate of preterm birth compared to a 36.3% rate in the Makena group or the progesterone group. So it didn't really look that the progesterone was effective as much as the placebo group having a very high rate. I also just want to point out on this slide that in the MEAS trial, there was no difference between blacks and non-blacks as far as the effectiveness of the drug was concerned. Just to go back to that rate of 55%, that was far higher than was really ever seen in these other trials. We just don't see that clinically, a 55% rate of recurrent preterm birth that we saw in the MEAS trial. Most rates range from 17 to 37%. The other big problem with the MEAS trial was that it was supposed to be a multi-center trial, but it was a lot of the data came from women at the University of Alabama, which enrolled 27% of the study population and 43% of the Black women in the trial. So MEAS was fatally flawed. That's the phrase I typically use, not the person, obviously, but the study. The randomization failed. There was an atypically high recurrent preterm birth rate in the placebo group. In one site out of the 19 accounted for 27% of overall patients and 43% of Black women. And there was no clinical health benefit demonstrated. The newborns didn't do better, though there was decreased preterm birth. Despite the real flaws with the MEAS trial, it kind of sort of took off and it started to be recommended. FDA gave it approval in 2011, as Dr. Callender pointed out, despite the statistical review at the time. The statistical reviewer wrote that from a statistical perspective, the information and data submitted do not provide convincing evidence regarding the effectiveness of Makena, of 17P for preventing preterm deliveries. Despite this review, though, it did get approval, accelerated approval, which required a confirmatory trial. But if you think about it, and we can get into this, there's really no rush to do this from the pharmaceutical company's standpoint. Once it gets approval, rushing to do the confirmatory trial doesn't need to take place. And then what we saw with Makena was the basic things that we see with a corporate rollout or a pharma rollout or a product launch. How does pharma get you to buy their products? There's advertising, there's news coverage. They try to sort of build what I call a conventional wisdom around the product. And it's the same basic playbook we see whenever pharma is trying to build conventional wisdom around a product. Things like fear mongering about the disease, exaggerating the effectiveness of the treatment, downplaying safety concerns, villainizing critics, essentially rigging the system to some extent. What I mean by rigging the system is an effort's made to try to get individuals and groups that should be working for the public good to actually be working to increase sales and profits. What you saw with the company was they started paying thousands of doctors. In 2018, this is from ProPublica. In 2018, AMAG Pharmaceuticals paid 5,800 doctors regarding Makena in 16 teaching hospitals. You may wonder, how did they get all that money? But it was a highly profitable drug. In the 2017 and 2018, they had sales of over $100 million a quarter. And as Dr. Callender pointed out, 17P costs about $15 a dose. They were charging $800 to $1,500 a dose. So there was lots of profit margin and lots of money to be spread around. The company was sponsoring ads on the major journals. This was a wrapped ad. You couldn't actually access this journal without going through the ad. This is the official journal of the American College of OBGYN. They were sponsoring the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. They were the top corporate sponsor in 2018 with $100,000 in donations or more. It ends up setting up what I describe as like a medical industrial complex where you get a profitable product like Makena, and then the money from that is used to sponsor professional medical societies, physicians, researchers, and other groups that then help to build a scientific consensus around that drug. And then it increases the drug's use, which then leads to more profits, and the cycle sort of continues. I'm borrowing that term medical industrial complex from Dwight Eisenhower, who talked about the military industrial complex, the same thing happening with military. This was his final speech as he left the White House in 1961. So what were we doing in Framingham during this time? We really weren't using it. And part of that was the way I was counseling patients. I was concerned about the risks, and I told my patients that there were safety concerns with the product, including injection site reactions, depression, blood clots, gestational diabetes, stillbirth, cancers, effects on the developing fetal brain, and unknown long-term effects. And many of these, not all of them, but many of these are actually on the FDA label. So these aren't made up things. This is actually, some of the risks. And when you go over with patients these risks, as I listed here, as well as the lack of benefit, I'm just skipping ahead. There are no proven health benefits. So when I counsel patients that there are risks, there are no proven health benefits. Most patients will decline it in that situation. I thought it was interesting though, because it became the standard of care. So I guess you could have accused me or accused the population in Framingham of not following the standard of care or of not following the scientific consensus. But it turned out that my patients were making a good decision and not taking it, because it turned out that it was not effective. I wrote here, I got disciplined. I actually had a boss call me in and say, "You're not giving enough Makena to patients." And I remember that conversation well. And meanwhile, at the time, we were waiting for the confirmatory trial result to come. And that trial result came in 2019 with the prolonged trial, as Dr. Callender pointed out. And in this trial, Makena completely failed. It didn't just fail to show a clinical benefit, which was what it was supposed to do. It failed to even prevent preterm birth in the trial. What I thought was going to happen in March of 2019 was that it would be immediately pulled, because people would say, look, we're giving an ineffective synthetic hormone to pregnant women. We have to stop doing this. But it was not immediately pulled. I felt like this was DES all over again, but it actually, what happened is the corporate spin started at that point in March of 2019. And what I mean by corporate spin is that what started to be spun out about the trial was that the MEIS trial was basically a US trial in a study of Black women, whereas the prolonged trial was an international trial in a study of white women or a mixed group. that wasn't actually accurate in large part, and there was no benefit shown based on race in the Meese trial. But despite that, they began using this racial equity argument. And they also started saying that real world evidence would prove their product to be effective, which was not true. The real world evidence was actually not showing it to be effective. Studies from Dallas, Pennsylvania, Boston, actually numerous studies were not showing the drug to be effective. And not in this actually slide shows that really only the Meese trial showed it to be effective, and that all subsequent trials did not show the drug to be effective. This goes back to the original point I was making, though. The original study, actually, in the Meese trial, there was no difference between Black women and non-Black women in terms of the effectiveness of the drug. SMFM and ACOG, I think, could have helped in 2019 by calling for it to be pulled off the market, but they didn't. They came out with a statement arguing for shared decision-making. And again, this sort of thing, when professional medical societies are doing this sort of thing, it should make us remember that even though the drug wasn't proven to work and carried risks, everybody sort of continued to support. I wrote here, everybody in the green box. What I mean by that is this green box here of what should be groups that are working in the public interest, which are your professional medical societies, physicians, researchers, universities. They often will lean towards the product in a sense, and that ends up continuing this cycle. So I guess the point I'm making with this is that Makena wasn't proven to work, but it did work for many key stakeholders in the equation. Physicians had something to offer. Researchers were getting their research funded by the pharmaceutical company making the product. Key opinion leaders were getting paid, and major physician groups were also getting paid by the maker of Makena. And this is what I mean by how the system gets rigged towards use of the product, because these groups, which should be working predominantly for the public good or public interest, also then develop an interest in working for the drug company and keeping this product on the market. This dynamic actually became obvious at the FDA testimony, where you had several groups arguing to keep Makena on the market that were being paid by AMAG Pharmaceutical, AMAG Pharma, who used to make Makena, and or Covis. And actually, this was pointed out very well by Reshma Ramachandran on her Twitter feed during the course of the FDA hearing, where she was good at pointing out how many of these groups that were arguing on behalf of Makena actually were being paid by the drug companies. The racial equity argument Dr. Callender got into, it was, I think, absurd from the get-go. As Dr. Callender mentioned, Black women do have higher rates of preterm birth, but keeping an ineffective drug on the market so it can be injected into them, it doesn't do anything to help Black women or the Black community. And that was just a corporate spin to try to keep the product on the market. And I would argue that it was sort of an unethical corporate strategy. I'm just going to jump ahead on that, on the spin. In October of 2020, actually, FDA called for Makena to be pulled off the market initially. And this goes back a little bit to the timeline. That's October of 2020. That's 2 years ago. But it stayed on the market and it continued to generate significant profits. As Dr. Callender mentioned, $700 million from 2018 to 2021. And most of those years were after it was shown to actually not work as a drug. In October of 2022, just a little more than a month ago, the FDA, the advisory committee voted 14-1 to pull it off the market. The next step, hopefully in the coming weeks, will be that it will be pulled off the market. In terms of lessons, just wrapping up here, I always like to point out, as somebody who takes care of moms, pregnant moms and babies all the time, that drugs are chemicals. Chemicals have consequences and chemical effects in biologic systems. Products, whether it's drugs, devices, they tend to drive a cash cycle. And this cash cycle creates what I described as a medical industrial complex. So you can have a drug that doesn't work for patients, but it does work for everyone else in the process financially. The last thing I just wanted to touch on is the importance of not silencing physicians and the importance of having people speaking out, as I did about Makena for years. It's important. We're hearing a lot now of the importance of silencing people for misinformation, but I think it's very important for physician and physicians group to push back against that, because we need voices, even voices in opposition, to be heard and not stifled. That's a law that's coming out of California, AB 2098, which is trying to clamp down on misinformation. If you're saying something that's not what the scientific consensus is or standard of care, you can risk losing your medical license. I think that's going to have a chilling effect and will hurt patients in the public. And in fact, I was saying something that was not the scientific consensus or the standard of care for the last decade or more, as far as Makena went. And it turned out that what, as science progresses over time, what was actually shown was that the drug was not effective. So just to get back to the question, I'm going to wrap up here. The thing that puzzles me, or puzzles a lot of people, is how does a drug that works get injected into pregnant women for 20 years? And the reason is that it does work in the sense financially for lots of people and lots of groups involved. And this is the problem actually with a lot of what's going on, not just in medicine, but in society as well. And it doesn't work. The drug didn't work in the sense of actually preventing preterm birth or for the public good, but it did work financially. And when that occurs, you'll see that it can continue to be used. I just use this as a parallel to the military. People look at the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and said, you know, we were there for 20 years. It's like we used Makena for 20 years. How could that happen? It didn't work. But it does work in terms of generating profits for corporations, in the case of Afghanistan for military corporations, in the case of Makena for drug companies. So that's why these systems continue to work, because they're generating corporate profits. And it's very important for all of us to sort of push back against that. So we work in the interest of what's good for patients, pregnant women, the public, and not corporate profits. Okay. That's the talk. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'm available for questions. I guess Ruben's going to run that session for us.
That's right. Thank you, Dr. Urato and Dr. Callender, for an excellent discussion on Makena, the issues of accelerated FDA's accelerated process, and how a lot of the different stakeholders really played a role in perpetuating this process. So I think now we'd like to move into our structured Q&A. So you can drop questions into the Q&A box, and I'll start reading them out. All good?
I have a question for Dr. Urato. I would like him to discuss his efforts with respect to Makena and making sure that people knew what was going on, and you know, the petition that he started with the FDA and that kind of thing. I'd like to hear more about that.
Okay, thanks a lot for asking. So I was concerned about this from the get-go, principally from the trial that came out when the MEAS trial came out back in 2003. I was worried because right off the bat, as I was showing in the slides, it looked like there were real problems with that trial, and I felt like they weren't getting enough emphasis. So sort of early on in the process, I started talking to people about it, and making an issue of it, and sort of making my concerns about it heard. As we went further over time, I eventually got together with Public Citizen, and we put together a citizen petition to the FDA to call for its removal. And then basically just working with groups and others to try to get the word out there about the drug, in giving talks on it, writing letters to the editor, that sort of thing, to try to raise awareness on the issue. Thanks for asking.
I think that's important for everyone to know, because like you said, don't silence physicians. And I think a lot of us don't really know how to speak up.
I think that's a great point. I mean, putting a citizen petition out there, writing letters to the editor, writing editorials. I wrote a few op-ed pieces, trying to give talks on it, and sort of get the other side. There's always I tell people this, there's always going to be voices in support of the product or of the drug, because there's drug profits to support those voices. So people who are on the other side of this, forces of non-intervention or against a drug or a device really need to be encouraged and supported, because those voices aren't going to get that same sort of like drug company funding or device company funding. So we really need to make sure we're making the effort in our society to hear those opposing voices on these issues.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I think I'll go with our first question here. So the question is, can you speak more to what the issues are in requiring the company to complete additional trials and also allow the company to continue to market the trial? Additionally, would the company be incentivized to do so if they can continue to sell the drug?
The company doesn't really have any incentive. The FDA does not require the company to do the confirmatory trial within any time frame. Yes, they have to do it and they have to show that there's benefit, but like, as you can see with this one, it's been 11 years since accelerated approval. And even when the trial came out and at the hearing, the company wanted more time, and they want to do another trial. And there really is no incentive for them to do the trial. And then when you think about it, for this medication, the company didn't do any of the initial trials. As we mentioned, this chemical compound has been studied since the 1960s. And the actual company that owns the patent now didn't actually spend the money to do any of those trials. So while they're raking in money, there is no real incentive to conduct further trials.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's right on the money. And I think that's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. Where the company can basically, the longer they drag their feet, the more profit they make. That's a huge problem with where the incentives are. In some people, there was a recent article, I think it was in the Pink Sheet, where they were making the argument that even the private equity firm, Apollo Management, who owns Covis Pharma, could have looked at this issue and felt like, you know what, it makes sense to get the drug, because if there can be continued delays and wait for the FDA meeting, you can still generate profit on that. And it was generating profit, as you saw from the figure that both Dr. Callender and I had put up there. From 2018 to 2021, it made about $700 million. And so it's a bit of a crazy system that allows us not to have a more defined endpoint to try to force the companies to do the trials quicker and get the confirmatory studies done.
Absolutely. We have another question here. How's the recent vote to consider removing the drug shifted how pharma is marketing and talking about the drug? And additionally, are their partners taking a second look at their support? I guess particularly the professional societies.
To my knowledge, the websites are still up and the drug is still being, basically, we're still at where we were. And I think it's interesting that the professional societies, ACOG, Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, have not been vocal about having it or getting it off the market now. This really disappoints me, because I'm a member of both groups. And the both groups should really be serving pregnant women and providers and trying to make sure that pregnant women aren't being injected with ineffective medications. But because of the way professional medical societies get funded, many of them do develop a predisposition towards sort of leaning towards what the drug companies want. And in this case, both of these societies have not been outspoken to try to get the drug pulled off the market. And they both sort of remained on the sidelines during the FDA meeting. And I think that really jumped out to a lot of people. So you had basically an FDA meeting about a preterm birth drug getting pulled. And essentially you had the American College of OBGYN and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine standing on the sidelines and basically not making a statement during that hearing.
Thank you. We have another question asking about Dr. Jurado, how do you talk to patients about Makena when there's no other option for prevention of preterm birth? They go on to comment that during the advisory committee meeting, it was remarkable to see so many MFM doctors urging the FDA not to withdraw the drug because they don't have any other alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a really good point. And the argument that we make is that giving someone an ineffective drug because there's no other drug available doesn't make any sense. That's not the way to manage preterm birth, to say that, well, we don't have an effective drug, so we'll give you one that we've got here. That just the reasoning is not good for that. And so what I was doing throughout the past since 2011, since it was approved more than a decade, was counseling patients on it. I did let my patients know what ACOG stance was, what SMFM stance was, their recommendations, but I did review with each patient what I saw as the risks as well as the benefits, of which there really were no clinical benefits from that trial. And most of my patients, based on that, declined it. So we were not using we're using very little of it in my community. But I did standard counseling, which is to go over risks, benefits, and alternatives, let them know what the professional societies had recommended. But I think it's a very good point, which is that we don't want to be using things on anybody, not just pregnant women, just because it's there and because there's no other option. We want to make sure if we're using a drug that it's safe, that it's effective, and that it has proven clinical benefit.
Dr. Callender, I'll address this question to you. Do you have any ideas over appropriate levers or ways to push back against professional societies when they start recommending things that don't seem to be in the patient's best interest?
I think the best thing is, like Dr. Urata was saying, I mean, you have to have these conversations with your patients and give them the information that they need to make an effective or to make an educated decision about their own care. It's tough to fight back against, these very big organizations. Like we mentioned, they're getting money from corporations, and that does impact what they say and what they recommend. But as a clinician, it's important to talk to your patients and make sure that they have the information that they need. And also, like Dr. Urata was saying, speak out in whatever way you can, give talks in your community, write letters, write op-eds and things like that, to make sure that that other perspective does get heard.
Thank you. We actually have another sort of clinical question. Would you prescribe it to a patient that if they wanted it after discussing the risk versus benefit profile? And if so, if you don't think it helps and potentially harms, what would you do?
I think you have to give the patient patients have autonomy, right? We give them information and they make decisions about their own healthcare. And I'm sure this is not the only medication or surgery or procedure that some physicians think is not really the best idea. But if the patient chooses that, knowing all of the information, then that's their prerogative. But it's important that we make sure that we give the patients the information they need to make the best decision for them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was a drug that's on the market. It is on the market, and I think that that's the responsibility is to give accurate counseling, to review risks, benefits, and alternatives. But if the patient opts to elect to get a drug or take a drug that's on the market, then that's what they're doing. And then you support them and you support your patient, and you work with the patient. I think that's right.
Yeah. And, whatever we say, there's this understanding, and this is why it's important for the FDA to do what is right. There's an understanding among patients that if the FDA approves it, it must work. It must be safe. That's what people believe. And so we're working kind of against that, that understanding. So it's out there, it's available. We can't, it's not ethical to say it's not available, but once it's out there and it's approved by the FDA, patients are leaning towards thinking that it must be okay.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with how prevalent the advertisements can be.
Right.
Very insidious. So Another question, can you speak to how clinical trial diversity was leveraged in making the case for Makena or against?
That was interesting. It kind of surprised me when that came up because I had spent a lot of time reading the data and everything, and just the idea that it's beneficial to one group of women but not others, it just didn't make any sense. And like, as we both mentioned at some point, there's no evidence that it works. And even if you look at the, yes, there was a higher percentage of Black women in the first trial, very much higher than in the second trial. And that was pretty much necessary because of the ubiquitous use of Makena in this country. So they had to go to other countries to really get a fair assessment of people who had not been exposed to the drug. But even if you look at just the Black women in either study, there's no evidence that it works. Yes, preterm birth, and as with many other medical problems, occur disproportionately among Black women, and it's definitely a problem that disproportionately affects our community. But it does not benefit our community to give them something that we know doesn't work, and something that we don't know the impact of in the long term. So I thought that was interesting and exploitive, actually. And the way they went about it also was just, it seemed very sinister. I mean, they wrote letters and had them disseminated by organizations or advocacy groups, and basically presented one side of the picture. Basically, that, like, one of the things that they focused on was this study had a lot of Black people, this study had very few Black people. That's not right. And maybe only focused on that in the letters that they sent out, and had people sign a letter saying that they support keeping it on the market based on how the second study is invalid because it didn't have enough Black people. But did you look at all of the details, all of the data of all of the studies? Probably not. They looked at the letter, the information that was given to them by the corporation. So it was clearly something that the corporation did in order to benefit themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just want to say, I think I found it to be, really deceptive and really bothered me, that approach. And if you really look at the numbers, Dr. Callender is right that the Meese trial had a significantly higher proportion of Black women compared to Prolong, but Prolong was such a large trial that there were a substantial number of Black women in that trial. There were hundreds of them, and they were able to actually do analysis on both trials, looking at whether or not the drug was effective in Black women or whether there was a difference in race, and there wasn't. So then to try to sort of wave a racial equity flag to try to keep the drug on the market was, I think, deceptive. I like sinister. It was the word Dr. Callender used. I thought that was awful, and really unfortunate.
And as a follow-up to that, this sort of weaponization of identity, is this a tool that these corporations have been using more recently, or something that you've noticed over the years, going back to when they really started to use the accelerated approval pipeline more?
I have read that there are companies definitely using the same thing. There's a drug for Alzheimer's, and people, or the company has said, if you don't approve this drug, you are harming all the Black people who get Alzheimer's, because there's, a disproportionate number of Black adults who get Alzheimer's. So, not approving this drug or taking it off the market is going to affect this group of people more than others. But again, it comes down to, does it work? Does it cause harm? And that's really what we need to focus on.
And I think I would just add to that, that it's important for everybody to keep in mind that what corporations want at the end of the day is profits. They're into profit maximization. So if they're using a racial equity argument, or if they're using some other argument, they're trying to use that as a means towards getting profit maximization. It's important not to, or never to lose sight of that.
Absolutely. I think this question is a good one to end on. What can we do, or what can Doctors for America do to prevent something like this from happening in the future? It's absolutely egregious that this drug continues to be available for patients. I agree.
Do you want to take that, Dr. Callender, or you want me to start?
I mean, there's a lot to be done. There have been a lot of conversations about changing the accelerated approval process. There was a recent study by the Office of the Inspector General that looked at how much money is spent on these medications in between accelerated approval and when they finally do get, if they do get approved. And it's huge. It's just a ridiculous amount of money that these companies are making on drugs that may or may not work. So a lot of different stakeholders have been talking about making changes to this process. And more recently, in more recent years, people, or the FDA has been more critical of some of the drugs that have gained accelerated approval and about what to do with them. So, you know, one thing is being on the FDA task force for Doctors for America, maybe even becoming part of one of these advisory committees on the FDA, speaking up at these hearings, making sure that your voice is heard, making sure that the perspective of the patient, of the clinicians gets out there. So there definitely are opportunities available for us to be part of the system. And so we can learn more about those opportunities and take advantage of them.
I agree with that. And I think it's just important that that we make sure that groups that should be working, groups and individuals that should be working for the public good or in the public interest, like our professional medical societies, our universities, the FDA, et cetera, are making sure that they're actually working in the interest of the public good and not to try to increase corporate profits. And that's what happens when you get this influence from, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or the device industry. You end up when those industries are influencing groups like professional medical societies, physicians, universities, and whatnot, where those groups that should be working in the best interest or in the interest of the public good or the public start to actually change their message or change what they're advocating for towards what'll be best for profits. And that becomes a toxic situation. And that's when people start referring to the system as being rigged, as we see, you know, with politicians or whatnot, when the politicians are working in the corporate interest rather than the interests of the public or the public good. So I think it's important for Doctors of America or any other groups like that to make sure that they're firmly on the side of working in the public interest for the public good and staying true to that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can agree. I think informed physician advocates are a powerful tool to be mindful of corporate influence and keeping institutions accountable. So thank you for our speakers today. I'd like to close today's events by thanking our panelists for this thought-provoking discussion. We're really grateful that you could join us today. And some of us even seeing patients, so that's pretty crazy. I also wanted to share a couple of quick reminders. This event will be available for viewing later on DFA's YouTube channel. Subscribe and like. Please take 2 minutes to complete our survey so we can learn more from you about what went well, what didn't go well, and what sessions you might like to see in the future. You'll find the survey link in the chat. And then also thank you guys for being here and for all you do on behalf of patients. We hope you'll become an official DFA member today. You can take a look at the benefits of memberships on our website. The number one reason doctors, medical students, and health advocates join DFA is to be with other like-minded people that share the same values and priorities. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook to stay up to date with all our programming and other ways to get engaged. And there's also links in the chat to join topic issues like the FDA advocacy group, which I think you'll find is very necessary after this group. So thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.